You mentioned two things I'd like to get into here. The misconception of abortion as a right.
Mm. Well, I think one thing I think we have to perhaps be a little bit more vocal about, I think this is something pro-life feminism is good at talking about, because perhaps we do talk so much about the female experience, is that we agree with the right to bodily integrity. Now, there is a difference between bodily integrity and autonomy. It's not quite a point of semantics, it's quite important, but we do agree with the right to bodily integrity. And in fact, whether or not we're aware of it, the right to bodily integrity is very central to all sorts of other rights.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it has a huge influence on the way the police are allowed to behave or are supposed to behave. It has an impact on the way teachers behave in the classroom, the way doctors behave. You know, the fact that a doctor can't operate on a person without them signing a consent form, that teachers aren't allowed to bash children in the classroom if they misbehave. The fact that, people have all sorts of rights if they're arrested. These are all connected up with the right to bodily integrity. The fact that we accept that people do have rights over the perimeters of their own bodies. However, when it comes to abortion, you have a possible conflict of rights there. You have the woman and her right to bodily integrity, and you have the right to life.
Mm-hmm.
And my opinion is, and my feeling is, that when there is any kind of apparent conflict, the more paramount right, the more fundamental right has got to come first. That doesn't mean that the right to bodily integrity does not exist, but the right to life trumps anything else in that particular point. Now, as it happens, we in fact instinctively realize that, and that is something we accept pretty, not, I would say without question, but with a lot less questioning in all sorts of other areas of our lives. For example, we've been under lockdown for the last 3.5 months in Britain, as I think you have been in parts of the States at least. The overwhelming majority of people in this largely liberal secular country have accepted being under house arrest for months. They've accepted the loss of their livelihoods, the closure of their children's schools, not being able to travel without the police asking you where you think you're going. I mean, you can't begin to imagine what an affront it is to most Englishmen to have a policeman tap you on the shoulder and ask you where you're going when you're going about your lawful business. But we have accepted. I mean, I found it's been extraordinary what's happened in the country, and yet for most of us, it has been relatively straightforward to accept, because we accept the idea of the greater good and public health and the need to protect the vulnerable from illness. And, even though there have been pockets of protest, the majority of people have gone along with that. And if that's the case in this situation, we are accepting that actually it isn't just about us, and it isn't just about our bodies and our lives and our rights to decide. It is actually about the common good and about the care of other people, particularly the safety of the most vulnerable. And that's probably the most extreme example anyone's had to deal with pretty much ever. This is an unprecedented situation. But in fact, we have situations like that in our lives all the time, where people are prepared to hold back on their call for their own rights for the sake of others.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that touched on the second thing I wanted to talk about, which was the conflict of rights. When we have one right in conflict with another, this can be framed sometimes as, well, all rights are equal. And then you can say, well, no, there is a hierarchy to rights, in which case we then have to identify what is that hierarchy. In America, I've always thought, this is pretty easy, or there's at least a very broad strokes method to this, to establish a hierarchy. It's enshrined in our Constitution, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I'd argue that it's in that order as well. So, hey, liberty, it's bodily autonomy. However, life comes before that, because you can't have liberty without life. So
yes.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, that's exactly the position I'd be coming from. The reason I see the right to life as the first right, as the paramount right, is because you can't enjoy any other right without it. All other rights become meaningless if you're not alive to enjoy them. And even beyond that, one has to look as well at what it means to ask a person to cross that boundary. When we talk about abortion as a right, as we were talking about earlier, whether it can ever be framed that way, we do forget that a third party has to be involved with this.
Mhm.
And one thing we have to really talk about, which we don't talk about nearly enough, is what it means to expect a person to end the right to life.
Mhm.
What it means to ask a doctor to insert a needle, to insert a vacuum aspirator, what it's like to have to take the moral responsibility for that. And one thing I've really looked at is the impact psychologically that crossing that boundary has on those who are forced to do it for all sorts of reasons, doctors, executioners, even soldiers. And I've come to the conclusion that it is such a terrible barrier to cross, one that human beings are hardwired never to cross. There are very good reasons why human beings are not inclined generally to kill one another for the sake of the continuation of the human race, that we have to think about what it does to a person if they are put in that position. The One of the cases I've mentioned in the book, which was one of the saddest I think I've ever really come across, was the doctor who committed suicide. Do you remember that part where he walked out into the stormy sea?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that, I mean, that happened long before I was born. It was one of the early, it was quite soon after abortion was legalized in this country. But it did set me thinking about what it means to ask somebody to kill.
Mhm.
Because with euthanasia, for example, we talk about the right to die. We're not talking about the right to die. We're talking about the right to be killed. That's what it really means. So we're asking somebody to kill us. But the same is true of abortion. You know, you're asking somebody to take on a responsibility like that. And we're not stopping to think about what sort of a toll that takes mentally, physically, spiritually, dare I say it, on the person responsible.